John,
Yes.
you have been immersed in embodied AI,
Yes.
and I have not.
Okay.
Can you teach the internet through this video by
Right.
teaching me what's exciting about it right now? And basically, what's the current state of it? What can and can it not seem to do? And what's exciting about that currently?
So in the near term future, or right this minute, actually, the way it's going is you can see a massive amount of development on the humanoid bot front in terms of like Unitree just this morning, I was like, oh, there's another company and this robot can jump up in the air and stuff, which is not an easy task at all, by the way. It just in terms of physically, like the actuators and stuff have to move at very high speeds. So it's just like, well, there's a company I didn't even know about. And then there's a ton of companies in China that are working on this stuff. The thing that's happened lately in my mind is that we've gone to, well, number one, there's enough interest that people are putting in money into it. So that's one major point. But number two is and so therefore you can develop the hardware because you have to make your own actuators. None of the standard off the shelf stuff works. So that was a problem always. And so
How
that's
many of these robotics companies are making their own actuators?
I think every one of them that I've been able
Wow.
to ask the question has said we make our own. Now, I think eventually what will happen is that, it'll commoditize. So it was like the old days when you first made cars, the cars were all individually made and everything. But then eventually it was like, oh, door panels are a good idea. Steering wheels are a good idea. So the people can make these things. So it'll commoditize eventually. But we don't want to optimize too fast either. I was just talking to Scott Walter about that if you optimize too quickly, then you're going to optimize around the wrong standard. So you don't want to do that. For example, in the EU, where they optimized around the CCS charging standard when they should have waited and and gone with the Tesla standard because it's just a better connection standard. But anyway, so there's a convergence of the ability to manufacture actuators and other parts, mostly actuators, but also some other things in the bot that has not been there before. I think some of that, probably if there was enough will 10 or 15 years ago, that could have been made at the time, but there just wasn't, because the other big piece that was missing was the brains. That when you're trying to I did a couple of engineering classes way back in the 80s, and you have these PID controllers and things like that, and you're trying to heuristically program just really simple things to like stay upright and don't fall over and stuff, and it's just impossible. It's so difficult to do by hard coding, because every time there's a tiny little shift in things, you have to like create another if then statement that's like, oh, by the way, if it does this, then do this, and if it does this, then do this. And so that's just the ultimately simple thing. Try to imagine a humanoid robot like with all these different controls and balance points and everything. All of that stuff working at once is impossible basically to do with heuristic code, which is what Boston Dynamics found. They spent decades working on this, and they got their bot to walk and a bunch of other really cool things, but it's incredibly cumbersome to do it. And if you want to make one change, you're probably going to break 10 other things when you do it. So the big advance that has allowed all of this stuff to happen is the brains, that suddenly we're going to neural networks. We're going to like the same stuff that ChatGPT is using and everything. It's just being put into these robot brains. And all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, these things can balance themselves. They can pick up objects. They can also see the objects instead of you having to tell it exactly what it is and where to pick it up. Like a traditional industrial robot that's just like, pick it up right here. But if the object isn't there, it's just going to, grip some empty air and do nothing. So it's dumb. Very good at repeating the exact same thing over and over again, but really, really stupid. So I think that's the major advance. And I think the kind of step change in the brain's capability has allowed a bunch of funding to come about really, really rapidly, which has allowed the hardware to be developed relatively quickly. Because suddenly, as soon as people are like, oh crap, this thing can walk, it can do this stuff, it's like, yeah, let's throw some money at it. Let's see what happens. And at that point, suddenly that's a pretty big deal. The second piece of this is longer term, although good Lord, at this point, it might not be that long term because everything's happening so fast right now. But I have been a very firm believer that consciousness, and so not AGI necessarily, because AGI, as I always say, is a fancy hammer. It does stuff that you ask it to do, and it will only do stuff that you ask it to do. Now, it could do it in a super fancy way like ChatGPT. It's like, write me an essay on Tom Sawyer or something like that, right? And it'll do that for you, and it'll be really good, probably. But it only does things at your bidding. It doesn't have its own free will, more or less. So I count that as AGI. Most people think AGI is actually like a conscious entity, like iRobot or something, an actual robot. In my mind, that's a totally different thing. I call it an artificially intelligent agent. And in order for an artificially intelligent agent to come about, to actually have its own understanding of the world, its own consciousness, its own sort of human-ish kind of entity or being, I'm a very firm believer that it has to be embodied. It can't be something in a box. It can't just be sitting there just getting text. Now OpenAI is starting to change my mind a little bit, but they of course just made a huge deal with Figure. And so they're spending a lot of money and collaborating a licensing agreement with Figure Robotics to develop their hardware to put their software inside. So I think even they see that, but I'm a very, very, very firm believer that you have to have some sort of interaction with the universe physically in order to have a consciousness, which is kind of where I put artificially intelligent agents, which are much, much scarier than AGI, by the way. I mean, that's the kind of thing where it's suddenly like Hal going like, I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave. And you're like, oh no.
What you said reminds me of one of the multiple endings of the Japanese animation Evangelion.
Okay.
And which is popular enough that I'll hazard to throw it out to the internet. Millions and millions of people have seen it.
Somebody will get it.
One of the main characters, they just draw floating on a white background, and they're at a canted angle. There's no reference point at all. And they say without any reference point, it's difficult to define who you are. And so then they draw a line to represent ground, and suddenly the character is on the ground. And they say, now you have a reference point, but you're limited.
Right.
You've traded all these degrees of capability for this reference point. Right. But what you've gained is this ability to differentiate what is up, down, left, right, etc. And they continue adding constraints until it represents as close as an animation on a 2D screen represents reality.
Right.
And saying now you're compared to the first frame highly constrained, but you have high sense of self.
Right.
Is that what you're referring to, or something else when you talk about embodied?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, I was coming at it a very different direction, but I like it. I think it's really cool. I think that the idea of sort of self that you get from more and more constraint is actually valuable. I guess what I sort of think about it biologically in a way, and that is that we are the product of at least several billion years worth of evolution. And all of that evolution has been physical. Like, we were little like microbes, like floating around in the ocean and stuff. And then we ate each other and then, whatever. So it's been this very physical battle of like the survival of the fittest. And that is deeply encoded in us as anything, like there's a stink bug that's sitting on my keyboard right now that I'm staring at, but I'm like, how it got in here, I don't know. But it's like that sucker is encoded. That thing has got billions of years of evolution behind it. And so we all have this agency, even relatively primitive things, like anything that has a flagellum that can float around, it'll go towards light or towards food and run away from things that are like hot and stuff. You can test that in the lab. So even things much, much more primitive than ChatGPT have a sense of agency and a sense of desire. It's like, I want food, I want sex, I want protection from the elements wherever I can get them, things like that, just real basic stuff. And that's just missing from these AIs that are not embodied. And so my theory, philosophy of this, and again, this is just a personal philosophy, I could be totally wrong, is that the thing that's going to get to that sort of human level sort of consciousness is going to have to be something that interacts with the world. Because when you interact with the world, I mean, you just said that. You said the factory is limited by electricity. If you think about the factory as a giant entity, I would count that as embodied AI.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I love your definition now that you've.
Yeah. It's a weird, I mean, it's like a hive mind. Very cool, but gosh, that's scary. Maybe the freaking alien dreadnought is actually Giga Texas is going to wake up one day. It's going to be like, I'm conscious and what's going on, people? I'm like, oh, geez. But anyway, I
Luckily,
was going to say the limiting factor for this stuff is electricity, which is their food. I mean, it's, it's robot food. And so I don't know that something like ChatGPT can understand. It doesn't have a way of understanding the world like that at a very basic level. It's like if you're a bot and you're sitting there on battery power and the thing's getting down, it's like you've got 10% battery left. You're like, uh-oh, I better go find something to plug into. And then it's like, uh-oh, the power's out. What am I going to do now? So you start to have desires and you will act on those desires. And that's a really, really different thing than just sitting in a black box. I mean, just imagine have you ever been in one of those isolation tanks where they put you in the salt water and you just lay there in the dark? It's weird. But I don't know. I guess not, huh?
no, I haven't.
Okay. But so, I mean, I did it like once, but I was just imagining if you were a baby and you grew up in this thing. So imagine you never had any contact except that words came at you. And that's what ChatGPT has. Now it's changing because they're giving it video and stuff now, but the sort of original version of this is just words, and words are already totally abstracted away from reality. I mean, what does the word red mean? Like you have an idea of what it does, and I have an idea, but what if I was colorblind or we had different color receptors so that the exact wavelengths of all the lights and things like that, and I might think of more of an orangey red and you think more of a purpley red when you think of red. So just a really, really basic word.
Traffic lights in Japan.
Oh yeah.
They're the same color. They're the same color to my cones and my, what is it? Cones and rods.
Yeah.
Same color. They're called blue.
What?
Everyone calls it blue. Everyone. It is called blue. The government calls it blue. Everyone says it's blue. Go.
Yeah.
The same color.
So it looks green to you?
Yes.
Oh, geez.
When I ask people about this, like, that's green, right? And they're like, what are you talking about? Because it's been called blue. And I was like, hold up a color coupon. And
Yeah.
they're like, yeah, I guess it's green. It turned blue. Go.
Well, I mean, there you go. I mean, that's an entire cultural thing, but that just shows how slippery all this stuff is. And so if you're dependent on language is already, we've taken it in, we've pre-digested reality and we've spit it back out. It's like a McDonald's hamburger or something, as opposed to like the raw vegetables and the cow and stuff. It's like, okay, it's pre-processed and you're going to get something out of it, but it's not a direct interaction with the real world at that point. It's a very separated interaction. So if that makes any sense.